Week's public talk. We are delighted this week to have one of our own, Rebecca Birrell, who she started life in Southport, where my family comes from. Then she went to study English at UCL, and jumping forward, she then did a PhD in art history and is now the keeper, or a keeper, of paintings, prints and drawings at the Fitzwilliam Museum. But in between, the pivotal and vital moment in her life was doing an MSc in Women's Studies at Mansfield College, Oxford. So we're very pleased to have her back, and we're pleased that she is impressed by how different it looks from 2013, 2014. And we're very interested to hear her amazing talk on her brilliant and rather beautiful book, This Dark Country, about women, artists, still life and intimacy in the early 20th century. And it's a brilliant book, so if you haven't read it already, I heartily and honestly recommend it. But we're delighted to have you here. Thank you for coming, Rebecca. Thank you.
Hello, I'm so delighted to be back here at Mansfield, which really fostered the intellectual interests that are at the heart of the book. Bit of feedback there. Hope that's all right.
Not.
No? Talk very loudly until that's resolved. Okay, so yes, so I'm just really happy to be back here, and thank you so much to Roz and for Helen for inviting me here. So today I'm going to talk around my book with a couple of readings from the book, rooted in my research now, which is connecting these artists not through their still life, which is the thesis of this book, but through religious imagery, in particular that related to saints and the Virgin Mary. So broadly, my work now is on the modern afterlife of religious art, and in particular how women and queer artists found solace and a sense of identity in these works. For women and queer artists and writers in the 20th century, religion was not a staid set of behaviours confined to a church, a way of practicing purity and obedience, or a means of guaranteeing a place amongst the sinless in a heavenly afterlife. The impulse to narrate, contain, and share extraordinary experiences customary in biblical texts was put to other, more radical use. What if the moral lessons forwarded by Scripture suggested you were inferior, insignificant, shameful? What if spiritual goodness had never been yours to claim? What if your deepest desires were regarded as wrong, your life beyond salvation? What if, nevertheless, a part of yourself felt miraculously seen or understood in certain images? The Virgin Mary, in the moment her life has changed forever, told she will conceive Christ. Saints subjected to torture for their unruly wills, radiant in their defiance. On its surface, religious art retold stories that had existed in culture for centuries, their essentially disciplinary pedagogical function unchanged. These paintings were advertisements as much as they were warnings about virtue done right, social norms obeyed, familial expectations met, whatever the cost. However, for these women, this tradition became a springboard for radical thinking and wayward feeling. In their work, religious thought housed desire, anger, shame, fantasy, and longing, and did so with a fierce ambivalence which ultimately transformed the messaging of their origin texts. So when the women in this book were coming of age as artists, training in the Western European tradition at art school, historical paintings depicting scenes from the Bible were still regarded in more traditional institutions as the moral and aesthetic high point of art. Even the Slade School of Art, which was radical pedagogically in allowing mixed life drawing classes, centered its prize culture around the successful completion of work on biblical themes. Biblical paintings were a challenge, a demonstration of skill for multiple reasons: in being large physically, in demanding various light and landscape effects, in being full of human physicality and anatomical variation, necessitating different bodies and age groups, and even the challenge of conveying the word made flesh. In requiring research into biblical costume and theological texts, in communicating biblical narrative, which frequently relies on making the utterly inexplicable feel real, in often straddling a number of temporal frames, showing the unfolding of time within a single image, in intending to elicit strong emotions, and even faith itself. Yet the women in this book did daring things with biblical painting precisely because they shirked these particular challenges. Their versions of biblical scenes are small and domestic, they are elusive and unspectacular, They are ambiguous in their feelings that they record and that seek to elicit, and they only ever hint at narrative. More radically still, they put front and center what exists in biblical paintings merely as decoration or implication, women's inner lives. So there are 6 women in this book, This Dark Country: Carrington, Gluck, Nina Hamnet, Vanessa Bell, Gwen John, and Ethel Sams. But I'm actually only going to talk about the latter 2 right now because I have so much to say. So I'm first of all going to talk about Gwen John. So Gwen John was born in Wales at the end of the 19th century. She attended the Slade, then moved to Paris, where she lived for most of the rest of her life. John was fascinated by religious art, and indeed by religious feeling itself, converting to Roman Catholicism in 1913. And John, to me, is particularly influenced by paintings of saints. So for women uninterested in marriage and reproduction, what typically guaranteed them social value and purpose, saints, who gain lasting recognition through great deeds and virtuous conduct, who live for their spiritual vocation and away from men, who experience rapture that is profoundly emotional and sensual, but not exactly normatively sexual, mapped out an alternative life and set priorities. Women saints begin emphatically timid and naive, the ordinary course of their life unfolding before them, then experience a radical and sudden reversal of self, one which is not just spiritual and emotional, but is often sexual and gendered. They assume male identities to fully realize their destinies. They leave their families and communities forever. They fight, suffer, and die horrible deaths for their spiritual commitments, rarely compromising their independence, physical resilience, or inner strength. Powerless as mere women, saints visited by divine powers suddenly find themselves with unexpected authority over time, matter, and mortality. The miracles that define their saintliness, which transform their environments, which defy the realities of human life, could not take them further from femininity as traditionally conceived. So just as hagiographical literature possesses narrative and stylistic norms, partly a way to make their stories memorable and lasting in the minds of the faithful, paintings of saints, female ones in particular, follow a distinct pattern. Saints pose with the objects through which their martyrdom has been achieved. St. Lucy carries a dish from which her plucked-out eyes stare. St. Agatha reveals her breasts like jellied fruits on a plate. These women have been mutilated and humiliated, but they gaze out of these works with a look of assured self-possession. In the narratives of their lives, great loss is followed by divine recognition. They lose their limbs or their lives, their families, but they gain God's approval, and through that a form of immortality and invulnerability, ineffable concepts which paintings struggle to visualize. Paintings show the exceptional status of saints through a redoubling of their physicality and form, their losses translated into extraordinary presence, which frequently appears akin to a perverse form of reproduction. St. Lucy looks intently out at us, unwounded, another set of eyes unblinking before her. St. Agatha sports an unblemished silhouette, her breasts pert and alive in her hands. These paintings are spectacles of female survival. The susceptibility to violence typically experienced by women in a patriarchal society is here recast as a heroic force. It grants women a moral greatness. It does not stamp them with passivity or weakness. Their bodies are meaningful in how they bear symbolic and narrative reference, and in their magical unnaturalness, rather than through their purity or perfectibility, or in their screening of male desire. For a woman like John, the liberatory potential of this tradition for a woman artist was clear, but perhaps it ran deeper than that, and to her the struggle of saints was emblematic, a possible figure for her pursuit of a different life to that awaiting her as a middle-class woman, one dedicated to creative work, higher aspirations, and deeper philosophical questions, rather than dutiful domesticity. So here are some other examples of some traditional saints. So first of all, I'm going to read a short passage from the book, which is about John's reworking of the St. Cecilia myth. So here we go. One of Gwen John's earliest interiors shows a woman playing a violin. The scene is quiet with the insularity of a turn-of-the-century middle-class adolescence. With no windows and doors, the only marker of the social world beyond is the man's hat hung on the door, making clear who is able to freely traverse the boundaries of the home. That power and mobility is not her own. The faded gold that surrounds the sitter suggests a long duration in which the riches of an only partly chosen solitude have begun to wear thin. Alone, her talents lack an audience. This is not a private concert held by a professional, but an amateur dutifully undertaking her practice. Music is on a chest at her feet, a laundry basket behind her. Nothing in the setting is formal enough to place us inside even a casual recital. The woman is unassuming and industrious, intent upon self-improvement, modest and disciplined, her creative work aspiring not to glory or recognition, but to a solid competence. The laundry is a reminder that art is not her natural domain. Domestic work will soon take over, which is to say that her humble ambitions have cause, her gender. The young woman's steadfast commitment to her craft is powerful, but it's not the whole story. Fascinated by hagiography throughout her life, Gwen was thinking here about Saint Cecilia, the patron saint of music, who is normally pictured with an organ, but who in a number of famous examples plays the violin. And in fact, in this example by Gentileschi, it's actually Artemisia Gentileschi who modelled for this particular image. On the wedding day of the avowedly chaste Saint Cecilia, her resistance to the ceremony manifests through singing to herself, addressing God alone. The female voice is the path to a higher power, and it's a path out of the humdrum expectations of a woman's life. In Saint Cecilia, music and refusal are intertwined. In Cecilia, marriage is transformed into a radical heretical act. Converted on Cecilia's urging, for female sound is both divine melody and transformative rhetoric, her husband is condemned to death, and Cecilia is set to follow. 3 times the sword falls on Cecilia's neck, but no mark is made. No man can destroy her, not unless she wills it. She survives, if only for a few more days, after which she rises into heaven, triumphant. Cecilia's narrative links willfulness, tenacity, and inviolable belief with female creative acts that emerge out of necessity from the margins. The story which Gwen chose to convey the experiences of a young woman and to showcase her own burgeoning talent is about commitments that eclipse one's own frailties and the cruelties and ignorance of others. So this painting here, Young Woman Playing a Violin, was John's earliest painting. And as you can see from a work some years later, the kind of general composition is quite similar. And this is partly about saints, as I will go on to discuss, but it's perhaps more vividly about Dutch genre painting. So these works see male painters stealing into women's private spaces, observing them at leisure and in vice, asking the viewer to extract from them a moral worth. Women's silk skirts glimmer against dark wood, and light moves through windows, illuminating their faces, indicative of their virtue. They read, they are good wives, they play music, they are good mothers. They sew, they are good daughters. They make lace, they are productive and obedient. They are the glowing centres of domestic spaces. When women's vanities are glimpsed, they are quickly chastised. With its iridescent light and contained space, Gwen's work absorbs the idiom of Dutch genre painting, and in doing so makes visible the years of research given over to this apparently spontaneous everyday scene. Not content merely to copy, Gwen sets about rewriting the values at the genre's core. In the Dutch tradition, the painter's control over and distance from domesticity is stressed, while Gwen explicitly places herself inside the scene, but this is a self-portrait of herself. Nobody would define the space on her behalf, nor would they instruct her on its true worth. Gwen paints herself into the tradition and slips into its implied virtue, but without any attachment to her household, and with a life centred around the distinctly self-serving pleasures of solitude and art. The challenge is clear. Under Gwen's direction, virtue might accommodate an entirely different kind of woman. So the kind of different sort of woman that this virtue, that this new kind of domestic genre scene might kind of accommodate, I think is a woman who is more sort of interested in the saintly pursuit of knowledge. And that's what I'm going to talk about now, a very short passage from the book, which is thinking about these two paintings side by side, and so John reworking this St. Jerome imagery as well. So in the painting, The Room on the Courtyard from 1907, Gwen is dressed in black, in contrast to the luminous colour that surrounds her, as if proposing a contrast between her subjectivity and its surroundings. The beauty you see here is not my own, it states, nor this lightness. This is not as melancholy as it might at first appear. Gwen liked reticence, liked solitude, liked withholding from others, liked shyness, liked what some might call gloom, liked her penurious conditions, liked to dwell in the more painful aspects of her craft. The black is about pleasure, the dress shining against her like the dazzling dark carapace of a beetle. Gwen wavers between disguise and disclosure, announcing herself while hiding behind images of others. Gwen adorns herself with allusions to St. Jerome, the patron saint of scholars, translators, and librarians, famed for his intellectual pursuits. Like many saints, the story of Jerome is one of hardship overcome. Jerome retreats from society and heads for the desert and spends years moving through a wilderness that is his own penitence. Faith transforms him, and on his return to Rome, theological tracts follow, impressive in volume and skill. A wounded lion terrifies his peers in the monastery, but moves Jerome, and his healing of its paw turns the wild creature into a faithful pet, an eerie reversal which gives him further cause for belief. Jerome is depicted in paintings as Gwen is here, engaged in a precise private activity. He reads or writes while Gwen sews, and like her, he is alone except for his cat, fierceness softened into docility by his side. There is an aspirational quality to Gwen's identification, to be so accomplished and righteous, but there is also a certain impudence, a puckish disregard for patriarchal figures. The distance between an ordinary woman and a symbol of intellectual and religious authority is collapsed, and radically so. Our labours are not so different, Gwen's pose states. So, this is Gwen John, and part of what I hope that my research does is reveal how full of art historical thinking a painting like this is, what has tended to be thought of as sort of straightforwardly autobiographical, as sheer unmediated reality, as diaristic, as a record of John's rooms and preferences and little more. And so a kind of final note on this particular painting, which could be endlessly mined for pictorial ingenuity and intertextual interest. And this is quite revealing about what I've been doing in lockdown. It's on the subject of cats. I've recently got a cat. So the tradition of history painting, what it chose to focus on, what events and lives it recorded and elevated, had already undergone experimental revision through the work of 19th century French realist painters whom John would have known. John's elaborately and densely painted skirt, the cat and even the wicker chair, so look at that one final time, resemble compositional elements from this painting by Gustave Courbet, the artist's studio from 1855. So there is the fragment, and there is the absolutely enormous painting itself. So without Courbet's scale or grandeur, and through referencing the work's most quotidian details, John puts her work into conversation with Courbet. Courbet's work was artistically and politically progressive in highlighting all which history painting normally concealed, the constellation of deeply and grimly unequal social relations which underpins the flourishing of a successful artist, who is shown at work here on a venerated piece of pastoral, sandwiched between wealthy patrons and abject poverty, their oppositional relation to one another, quite literally framing and containing the possibility of his work. Yet the woman remains a muse, meaningful in being undressed and beautiful, leaning admiringly towards the artist as her master, and more closely akin to the animal than to the men that surround her, currents of misogyny condensed into a lower fragment of the composition. In the cat, illustrative of her animal nature, and in the cast-off, crumpled, frothy pink dress. 10 years later, in Manet's Olympia, this motif of femininity as unbridled animal sensuality and excess is even more explicit, and is again figured through the feline, with the black cat arched in excitement offering an additional erotic gloss to the nude female sitter at its side. So John's cat at once belongs to and gently mocks this system of symbols. Her cat motif insists upon a female pleasure joyously uncoupled from perversity and tethered to gentleness, quiet, solitude, self-sufficiency. John's small, domestic form of history painting does not aspire to the same avant-garde sensibility as Courbet or Manet, but it does address, if obliquely, if impishly, in recycled, vandalized details, in fabric and feline companions, the degraded status of women in realist painting. So I'm now going to stop talking about saints, and I'm going to start talking about the Virgin Mary instead. And it's going back to this very early work, this 1897 painting, Young Woman with a Violin. So there's another layer of religious iconography at work in the laundry basket, eerily illuminated at the player's side. John draws this work basket directly from Mary's chamber in depictions of the Annunciation, directly referencing her upbringing in the temple at Jerusalem, where she made priests' clothes. So the effect of the basket in the 1897 painting is to insinuate Mary's presence into this turn-of-the-century drawing room, although she might seem less well-suited to women's modernity than the saints. Mary is the prototypical mother, stable and consistent, her love continuous with self-sacrifice, less a human woman than a holy vessel who is celebrated for her meekness and obedience rather than for her courage. Western European art provided cultural space in which men could define women's purpose, and the figure of Mary was an ideal vehicle for this patriarchal project, giving rise to centuries' worth of visual experiences centered around a femininity synonymous with duty, fertility, and acquiescence. As a mother and virgin, Mary provided the impossible ideal against which all other women could be found wanting, and art played a big part in reinforcing her ideological function. However, John's fascination with Mary actually worked to shift and reinscribe these meanings. John uses imagery drawn from Annunciation paintings to impart importance on women's inner lives, and more radically, as an attempt to challenge the maternal duty and nurturance, or the heteronormativity implicitly demanded of women by these works. So, The Convalescent, which John painted a number of times in the 1920s, an example of which is here in the collection at the Ashmolean, shows a woman reading alone in a light-filled room. This scene is drawn from John's everyday life, its pleasures and routines, but it takes much of its emotional resonance from a scene quite apart from the quotidian domestic world, that of the Annunciation. These biblical scenes imagine Mary at the moment she is told she will conceive Christ, on the brink of a total transformation to her circumstances and subjectivity. When the angel approaches, Mary is interrupted in her private chamber in a moment of solitude and is shown often to be reading a book. Mary looks up from her book and in doing so accepts her destiny as a holy vessel, renouncing her independence, all in the service of a higher good. Reading reveals the studiousness and morality of Mary as the chosen mother of Christ. It stamps her with virtuousness, and it is there to stress that she is unprepared. The angel's coming is unexpected. She is innocent and lacks vanity. Yet virtue vies with more radical affects in the symbolic subterranean life of reading. For reading also represents a coming into knowledge that intermingles the sexual and the spiritual, with conception and reproduction intimately tied to faith and belief, forms of desire and fulfillment which sidestep sexuality per se. The complex status of reading reflects the genre's broader richness. Annunciation scenes are unusual in being representations of female subjectivity that do not attach women's worth to the beauty or desirability of her body. Her meaning is in her maternity, and while that is fairly normative too, women's reproductive capabilities are elsewhere in culture tinged with shame, and are here framed as superlatively important, regarded with reverence and transformative power, judged worthy of repeated attention and record. So John's notebooks, as well as the visual repertoire of her paintings, state her fascination with this grave moment of becoming, of holy intensity and spiritual responsibility, of embodied knowledge and heavenly encounter. Yet John was not interested in simply replicating the scene, retaining everything about the image that would be troubling to a woman like her, who was independent, uninterested in marriage and reproduction, who hoped to dedicate herself to her art. In the typical Annunciation scene, elaborate costume and rigid architecture, sheen of fabric and glittering surface of stone, frames symbolically charged stance, gesture, and action, all of which telegraph gravity and solemnity. A thread of narrative, the beginnings of Christ, is held taut between these details. These scenes are all surface, focused on event rather than character, to the extent that the private depth of the experience for Mary is lost, impacted beneath layers of retellings in which her role is simply to assent, to be physiologically present rather than psychologically complex. Mary is without interiority in a scene that likewise lacks intimacy, despite the sexual overtones of the message conveyed. The figures are held apart, dramatically separate, so as to remove any physicality or sensuality from the encounter. What Annunciation scenes do possess is an acute, mournful consciousness of time. The cycle of gestation begins in this moment, and there is only so much story between Mary's encounter in the chamber and her child's spectacular death. In John's work, this finely wrought, curiously impersonal, dense pictorial space is replaced with an airy ambiguity swirling with feeling. A single figure, regarded up close, a few simple objects, time resolutely stilled, no obvious story connecting any of it, but an enigmatic interiority implied in the sitter's deep absorption, sensual impressions of heat and taste and touch in the tea set, any severity of tone inherited from the Annunciation lightened by polka dot wallpaper. John's sitter, her Mary substitute, is adorned in the same blue tunic as her biblical model, but the similarity ends in this likeness of pose and style. Crucially, it's her gesture, her bowed head and downcast eyes that differ. She does not look up. There is no divine presence, no ceremony or obligation she must attend to, And so the woman is left to read uninterrupted, her life stretched ahead of her as simple and light and unburdened as the atmosphere of the picture itself, her identity and destiny, all her own choosing. This revision to tradition and its radical message about women's autonomy is put more clearly in earlier paintings, which are perhaps even more explicitly indebted to the Annunciation. So John painted a lady reading and girl reading at a window concurrently between 1910 and 1911. John planned for a lady reading to resemble a Madonna by Dürer. In this representation and many others, Mary is celebrated for her humility. In this moment, what Mary is granted along with the baby is faith, an acknowledgement of the glory of God, but with it comes an equally vital and correlative understanding of the unimportance of her own will, her body, or desires. The angel disappears in John's paintings, leaving only an allusion to their drapery in the curtains. The women do not stir and continue reading. The women are steadfast and absolutely in control. They refuse to be sacrificed in service of an abstract power judged superior to their own desires. In John's revision to religious iconography, it is self-belief and resolve which elicit awe, not submission, nor God. "I have often been without high aspirations," Gwen wrote in 1912. "I have wasted my time over little things, not thinking of what I wish to be." But nothing could be larger or more compelling or more concerned with the question of how to be than the ambition of these works, their interest in redefining what might render a woman worthy and miraculous, her life profitable or revolutionary. John's modern Madonna insists upon the right to live simply for herself and the sacredness of choice and autonomy in a culture which has long valorized women's willing renunciation of those freedoms, even integrating it into its founding myths. In this context, the woman stood alone reading in a room, undisturbed and invulnerable, becomes a radical, heretical figure. So to conclude talking about John, I'm just going to talk very briefly about the other religious work that she completed towards the end of her life. So a series of watercolors of people in churches and these incredible portraits of nuns. So John converted to Catholicism in 1913. For many turn-of-the-century aesthetes, Catholicism had a camp glamour that combined exuberant aesthetics with ritual and theatre, and all in primarily homosocial spaces. This grounding in local communities of women really appealed to John, and she also enjoyed aesthetically and effectively the heightened language of religious fervour. Her notebooks are absolutely full of it. To access God, John copied out whole passages on saints and long theological disquisitions, annotating with anguished appeals to various spiritual forces, and began painting religious subjects. John completed a series of watercolour sketches during church services, their quietness and attention evocative of prayer. Always allowing the faithful their privacy, John showed them from behind. The medium of watercolour, which John used for basically nothing else except these church sketches, suggests a desire for a medium as portable as pencil, but more substantial, more capable of approximating the aliveness and vitality of holy spaces. This was God's house, and John would not have it without the colour or texture or sufficient movement. So the nuns in her local community wanted a portrait of their long-deceased founder, as well as portraits of the living sisters in the cloister, and John began working from life from a series of black and white reproductions, becoming fixated with the task, which was often quite common in John's work. She would be given a commission and then would spend the next 10 years doing it and trashing it and trying to do it again. Yet even then, at the height of her religious feeling, John was eager to complicate the typical vision of female devotion and submission as embodied by the nuns, and she achieved this through an adjustment as subtle as that of facial expression. In most versions of these paintings, and there are quite a few in public collections, I think about 10, the nuns are sombre, expressions of glumness or serenity that mirror exactly the Mary John would have seen on gallery walls throughout her life. There are a couple of examples, however, in which the nuns look directly out at the viewer, a coy smile spread across their face. John was alive to the mischief of nuns, their unexpected willfulness, their dogged individuality in a space designed to eliminate it. And that smile says something about the waywardness of women in their position, who, in pledging obedience to God, guaranteed themselves a life of community and contemplation profoundly other to the ordinary course of a woman's life at that time. So I'm now going to talk briefly about Ethel Sams, who is the another painter in the book, who's probably the least well-known of all of the artists that I covered. And that there's a number of reasons for that. I think partly the letters, as I describe in the book, are completely unreadable. They're written for secrecy in a sort of cross-hatched way, so it's very difficult to kind of figure out very much about her life or her kind of artistic motivations. And I think also the other reason is that her work is profoundly domestic in its register and wasn't really following, I suppose, modernist trends. But religious imagery is also commonplace in her work. So she was an American-born painter who was best known in London in the early 20th century as a society hostess, dismissed by her contemporaries as shallow and sexless, and she turns up in the diaries of Virginia Woolf quite a lot in relatively derogatory terms, even though Woolf and Sams were very good friends. So Sams painted a number of luminous canvases addressed to the protected life she had built for herself and her partner, the artist Nan Hudson. So I thought I'd introduce this by looking at a portrait that's actually at the Ashmolean Museum of Ethel Sams by Walter Sickert, who was a friend of hers. The portrait's deceptive simplicity, even its cruelty, this is not a conventionally beautiful rendering of her face, obscures its playful costuming of Sams in imagery from another room, another century, another country, but not, Sickert implies, a wholly different world of emotional or spiritual concerns. Sickert is looking at Sams through a famous domestic reinterpretation of the Annunciation, Vermeer's Woman with a Pearl Necklace. Sand wears a strikingly similar plush-trimmed yellow jacket with a string of pearls to that worn by the female subject of Vermeer's painting. There's even a spontaneous dash of red behind her which resembles the luminous bow in the woman's hair. Vermeer's painting shows light moving through an open window and a woman with her hands raised in acceptance, Angel and Mary in their simplest form, the visual coordinates of the typical Annunciation scene put to subtle use. Sickert's portrait comes after Sand's 1911 work, The Chintz Couch, and perhaps his dressing of Sams in these iconographic references was a way of offering up his own reading of that painting's use of Annunciation imagery. So I'm now going to be talking about The Chintz Couch, and in order to do so, I'm actually going to read directly from my book. So here we go. This same Annunciation scene from the Fitzwilliam Museum where I work has turned up. As you might be able to tell from its presence in this presentation, this painting is currently positioned directly outside my office, so I spend quite a lot of my time looking at it. So, The Chintz Couch. The curtains are drawn. For a moment, the darkness appears total. What slowly emerges from the shadows? Spots of lilac, pond water green, dirtied gold, a palette balance between nature and artifice, and with it the creation of an exhaustive world onto itself. More, fabric that gives off static, muffled sound from the streets beyond. Belgravia, a townhouse purchased a few years earlier. The glint of lacquer. Scenes from related worlds adorn the walls. More wealth, more accumulation, more pleasure. The scent of lilies, faint pollen stains underfoot. Dust that settles on the skin and catches in the throat. A small fortune in a single room, a grand, calculated statement about status, a taste for 18th century French decor, flawlessly executed, is placed behind a locked door, submerged in indifferent dim light. Its function is to impress, to express something crucial about the passions of its maker, and so without an occasion to draw out its meaning, the room is simply this, an abandoned stage set, tense with expectation. Ethel Sams grew up the pampered child of American socialites. Money had made life exquisitely smooth at its edges, weekends spent mixing with the English royal family, a stint spent living in a series of well-appointed rooms at Claridge's, holidays playing bowls in the manor houses of the aristocracy. Raised to understand herself as the natural heir to her mother's role as a hostess, there was never any question of Ethel entering a profession. Her own dreams were irrelevant, and their dismissal accepted without complaint. She woke at a time set by her mother to be dressed by others in clothes she never chose, and ate according to the tastes and schedules of the household. She did almost nothing for herself, and under constant supervision, spent almost no time alone. She received a small education in literature and French, enough to make her conscious of how little she knew, and the rest of the day was spent contriving ways to fill the remaining hours with a governess or companion in one of the rooms cordoned off for her leisure. This was the routine she lived by for years. Some afternoons passed more quickly than others. Her life was frictionless, completely without fear or hardship or even much expectation, but it was not her own. After her father's sudden death, Scorning her future in the only way she thought possible, Ethel left her mother and 2 younger brothers and the responsibilities they represented altogether, setting out for a new life in Paris. Crossing the Channel with suitcases stuffed full of neatly folded cotton, satin, and lace, Ethel imagined the pretenses of recent years diminishing with the horizon. Who she was need no longer be so persistently defended or concealed. Never again would she stand in rooms enduring relatives calling her plain, and nor would she stumble over an appropriate response when young men perfunctorily asked after her ambitions at balls. She could finally answer with confidence, "I am an artist." While her mother had been painted by John Singer Sargent, the highest possible success for a woman of her social position, Ethel saw herself on the other side of the canvas. Few women were able to live as she did. Ethel was immersed within a social hierarchy that had furnished her with all of her privilege, freeing her to travel, paint, and educate herself without ever questioning whether it was possible. But she did so as an outsider of sorts, and at a cost. Accepting her family's money constituted a tacit acceptance of the rules that governed high society. While some elements of that world were suffocating and obsolete, norms regarding desire and ambition and appropriate pastimes, which were felt keenly as a limit on her own life, others were irresistible, the parties and dinners and material possessions, and most were simply too habitual to even question. After all, this was the only world she knew, and she had learned to thrive within its limits. Respectability enclosed a set of norms that allowed Ethel to move through her social world fairly anonymously. Passing as a heterosexual woman of her class was easy enough if certain behaviours were learnt and reproduced. But however much she manipulated these ideas for her own gain, the performance involved a subordination of her true self. If Ethel were to entirely comply with the moral directives of her class, then marriage soon beckoned. In the life that awaited her, art could never be a serious pursuit. The unspontaneous, unsatisfying years of her adolescence would be relived with only minor adjustments and expanded to fill the decades that followed. Above all, what Nan Hudson meant to Ethel would have to be concealed. In the Chintz Couch, the couch presses into the bottom edge of the frame, the tips of the skirt invisible, filling a drawing room that has already been vastly diminished in size through crop. The painting hints at the compromises that came inbuilt into the immense material privilege of the conservative upper classes, and in doing so delivers a warning. Beware the lure of the opulent room, for it might prove a gilded cage. Paintings within paintings are a signature of Ethel's work. Expecting a demonstration of skill, a microscopic recreation of an image, moving closer, it becomes clear that the forms are blurred. Ethel wipes her hand over the images as though they were still wet from being painted, and what is left are smudges, vague as after images. While each occurrence has its own distinct meaning, they often remark upon the level of light or direct the gaze to other objects. What this trick ultimately acknowledges is the control Ethel had over what people saw. Aware that her value was drawn from an aristocratic moral universe violently dismissive of her desires, Ethel began an elaborate campaign of misdirection. She drew a vague outline of the woman she was, or rather how she wanted to appear, and it was accepted. Unassuming, conventional, socially fluent but remote, dispassionate, poor raw material for a wife. There was great power in that. The life prepared for her disintegrated. This act of disguise became addictive, the risk of any richly rewarded demonstration of skill, or it became entirely habitual, as any daily performance might, because Ethel never stopped. The social world marked out by the Chintz Couch was Ethel's for life, and it was not out of necessity that she remained there, but out of a stance of obstinacy, out of choice. As a society hostess, she broke its most important rules surrounding sexuality and partner choice, but did so parading her transgressions as something else entirely. Through a mixture of her own guile and her circle's ignorance, Ethel broadcasted a carefully manufactured image of herself, and one that traded in the disorienting and liberating effects of blur. Nan at her side at parties and dinners, spinsters held together by shared circumstance, or close friends that behaved like lovers, or lovers who considered themselves life partners. For those around them, it was never wholly clear. So I'm just going to read a final little section about the significance of these lilies. Let me just find it. Yeah, here we go. The ripple of sunlight is a measure of the room's darkness. Only the arum lilies are immune to the shadow, and they are strangely clear-cut, as though transplanted from another painting. If the arum lilies are uprooted from elsewhere, Then it is from images of the Annunciation. These scenes depict Mary's transformation into the Madonna, a process that locates the miraculous in the gap between the seen, Mary's swollen virgin body, her baby, and the unseen, the angel, God's message, her faith. Ethel's room reverberates with thought about appearance and disappearance, display and artifice, broad queer themes relating to the experience of secrecy. Yet the allusion to Mary was perhaps a more personal metaphor for Ethel. While Mary's body betrayed the extremities of her inner life, Ethel's apparently virgin, spinster body was the sign that concealed her own spectacular act of faith, her rejection of heteronormative life, and her devotion to Nan. Much like the myths that sprang from the Madonna, Ethel's self-presentation played upon received ideas about women and sexuality. Women are either marked by sex or definitively outside of it, no in-between, Madonna or whore. While these myths were normally used against women to control their behaviour and set unattainable standards, Ethel deployed them to her advantage. The body she presented to society did not appear to desire, and in doing so threatened no order. It was as pure and one-dimensional as the arum lily placed inside her painting. Through removing her body from the conventional sexual economy, dressing to stress her plainness, her thinness, her dowdiness, Ethel slipped free of her responsibilities as a woman of a marriageable age. Mary transcended her straight sex body through a spiritual vocation, but Ethel's outward celibacy had more transgressive ends. To be dismissed by society as chaste, prim, and unattractive was to bypass an unwanted life and to settle into a queer one. Thank you.
Thank you, Becca. A very interesting talk, and I'm very interested in the way that you're describing these artists as having a queer sensibility and very conscious of what they're hiding and what they're showing. How conscious do you think that was? How far do you think that's something that they were engaging with, or how far it's something that happened to them and we are interested in because it's a concern of our times?
Yeah, I think that I'm not sure how much is intention, so to speak. But I think all of them were very, the kind of attention and energy that they put into creating domestic space suggested a desire to have a kind of an elaborately constructed private life, perhaps. So if you think about Charleston, for instance, we were talking about earlier, that was somewhere where so much kind of thought and feeling and attention went into creating a domestic space that felt accommodating to difference, in creating a domestic space that felt as though it could accommodate a kind of queer domesticity. And I suppose that in that respect, I do think that they were thinking quite consciously about, they were thinking about what it meant as women to not be married, to not be dedicating their lives to maternity, to pursuing a vocation that was traditionally dominated by men. So I think, although they wouldn't have directly, I think, thought of themselves in terms of queer theory, the queer theory that I bring to bear on them in this book, I think that they certainly saw themselves as leading unusual lives that were kind of different to the rest of the kind of heterosexual womanhood that they had kind of grown up with.
Oh, that's fascinating. I wonder if anyone here wants to ask any questions. I have a microphone so that people can start off. I'm going to have stunned everyone to silence.
I'm so sorry.
No, thank you. Yes, there's a question here. Please can you just wait for the microphone and then everyone will be able to hear the question.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm just wondering, the analogies you make, are they your own discoveries, or did Ethel Sams and Gwen John actually write about these other paintings?
So with Gwen John, I referred briefly to her notebooks in the talk, At the National Library of Wales, there's an absolutely enormous archive of Gwen John's material, which includes working notebooks from throughout her life. And I mean, as far as I'm aware, I think I'm the first person to have dedicated enough time to read through all of these notes. And although she does not directly describe, she describes the woman reading at a window as being after Durer's Annunciation, but she also spends a lot of time just writing notes about Annunciation scenes in particular. And again, in the archive, there's a small collection of postcard reproductions that were found in her flat when she died, and that included a group of Japanese ukiyo-e prints, but also Annunciation scenes. And so, again, although it's not a kind of direct intentional link, I know that she was really fascinated by this work. And so I think once I had that in my head, I was able to go back into the work, kind of looking, I suppose, for visual clues connecting her back to that work. As for Ethel Sams, as I mentioned, it's very difficult to I wish I had an image of her letters, which are written in this absolutely tiny script and then kind of written across. So something that I write about in my book is how impossible it was to get anything from this material. So I really don't know whether Ethel Sams was directly referencing this imagery in her work. Although for me, I think that just because of how prevalent these images were in their lives, in their kind of training as artists, but also just kind of culturally, I think that they would have absorbed so much of this iconography from when they were very young. I think that it could be direct, it could be indirect. So I'm not sure, basically.
You want to see some images of Ethel Sams' letters? There are some in the book. If you buy it, it's a fascinating read. And when you were talking just now about that kind of almost conscious interiority, one of the things that's very interesting about your book is that there are some quite long chapters about some quite well-known women artists with quite successful careers. And there are little snippety ones about people who perhaps didn't live so unusually for women of their generation and kind of disappeared.
Yeah.
And I did wonder, do you think that interior life was an absolutely necessary, or concentration on interior life was an absolutely necessary condition of being a woman artist in the early 20th century?
Well, indeed, and I think that, I mean, also having the class privileges in order to dedicate yourself to your private space was a very particular thing. And that's something that I go into in the book, because I think that's something that in sort of discussions with the Bloomsbury Group, in particular, I used to work at the Charleston Trust, and it used to frustrate me slightly that the narratives that surrounded Vanessa Bell in particular were very, she was presented as this kind of incredibly heroic figure, where it's like, how could she possibly have done all this work and pursued these love affairs and everything else, and without anyone ever mentioning that she lived with 3 servants throughout her entire life. And so the reason why she was able to kind of pursue her art was partly because of this support. And so partly the sections in between the kind of main chapters of the book, which look at these women artists who didn't manage to have the same kind of career as someone like Bell, someone like John, that was partly to acknowledge that not all women were able to organise their lives in such a way that they were able to kind of dedicate that time to their work. Also, in some instances, these women were of the same class position as Bell, as John, but still, other things went wrong and they just weren't able to. I think that I wanted to avoid this very kind of heroic, kind of liberatory narrative, this idea that the 20th century happened and then suddenly women had all this freedom and they were able to just do what they liked and it was, completely kind of uncomplicated, because it really wasn't. But how I actually came to those artists was purely organic. I'd never imagined that I would write about Winifred Gill, Helen Combe, Mary Catherine Constance Lloyd, and Edna Waugh. They were all women that I encountered just through archival research. They were women's names that kept coming up in letters, and then I just began to be really interested in them too, in these kind of much more marginal figures, in women whose work has disappeared into private collections, who perhaps their work was out of step with modernism even more radically than these women, who were painting things that were very private, that were very often quite kind of Victorian almost in their sensibilities. So that's the kind of rationale, I think, behind those parts.
It's very evocative and moving, the structure of the book. There are these voices that start and then stop, and disappear, and I think you capture it very well. The sort of silenced voices of the early 20th century as well. Does anyone else want to ask some questions? Being shy, Ros Ballister.
I don't even know if this is a question. I've just got a bit fascinated by your wicker baskets, and I wanted to know a bit more about them, looking at it there in the Annunciation. But also just wicker in general. So there's those two Gwen John women reading books where there's the chair in front. And it just made me think about, I mean, I just, in some ways I'd have just said, well, isn't this just showing off that you can paint a surface like this, and get the light moving through it and that kind of thing. But there's also something about spaces that contain something that hold women in, or that women sit in and whatever. And I wonder whether there was more to think about. The other thing that was just making me think about, but I'm sure this is just to some extent word association, because I've been teaching this week Swift's Ladies' Dressing Room, this kind of this sort of shocking poem about discovering women's laundry and its mess and its dirtiness in a domestic space where the female body is being idealised. So I just wanted to hear a bit more, really, about wicker containing spaces than you gave us.
Thank you, Ros. That all of that was really interesting. First of all, in terms of showing off, I think that you're absolutely right. And of course, the kind of Dutch genre scenes that Gwen John was inspired by, people like Vermeer, that was kind of what that work was doing. It was just showing off the kind of this sort of illusionistic kind of extents to which art could capture light and texture and atmosphere. And so I think that John was copying that tradition and just being ostentatious in terms of her skill, which again was something that had a slightly kind of radical resonance, her being a woman. As for the laundry basket, I totally agree about female dirt, and I think that is something that is implicit in these Annunciation scenes. Again, I think it's about using objects to highlight or to put in kind of oppositional relation to Mary's purity. And I do think that it's interesting because the basket in the Annunciation scenes is a more unusual figure, and it's something that's often only in Dutch and Flemish examples. And again, that's something that I would love for someone who knows things about Dutch and Flemish art to tell me why that is in particular. And also with the wicker chair, a kind of final note about the wicker chair is that John knew the woman who made this chair. She lived opposite this woman, and so partly, and in the work, there's this kind of desire to, again, the expression show off, to sort of showcase this woman's work. And again, this is something that was in the notebooks, that she was incredibly house proud about the few kind of objects that she possessed, and was also very encouraging of other women that lived around her in Paris, and had another woman craftsperson make her curtains, had a woman make this wicker chair. So, yeah.
I also noticed that the same room in those two paintings, you did the two 1911 ones, but they're different curtains.
Yes,
you don't bother
exactly.
to change the curtains
yeah.
for the purposes of the painting. Unless anyone is going to jump in at this stage, I think Rebecca's talked for long enough, and I'm going to take her and give her a drink. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, Rebecca, for an absolutely fascinating talk.
Thank you.
And Rebecca's book, published appropriately by Bloomsbury, This Dark Country, is available at all good bookshops and doubtlessly online as well. Next week isn't a talk, it's a recital. It's an organ recital on our newly restored organ. It's across in our college chapel. Do book in on Eventbrite if you'd like to see that. And then the week after that, we have our Hands lecture, Chris Bryant, railing against corruption in public life and Russian interference. And it's sadly more topical than it should be. But do come along, and thank you all very much for coming. Wonderful. That was a really fascinating talk.